September 1939, Ottawa, Ontario. The telegram sat on the oak desk like a death sentence. Britain was drowning in the Atlantic, losing 7,000 tons of shipping every single day to German submarines. The British Empire needed an arsenal. They needed factories that could pump out 300,000 rifles every month. They needed 2,000 new aircraft every year. They needed millions of artillery shells, thousands of military trucks, and entire fleets of warships. They needed a miracle. Instead, they got Canada. The numbers told a grim story. Canada's entire military force numbered just 4,500 active soldiers. Romania had a bigger army. Portugal had more tanks. Canada's pre-war factories had never built a single military aircraft. Not one tank had ever rolled off a Canadian assembly line. The country's ammunition plants could barely supply enough bullets for target practice. When war broke out on September 10th, Canada declared itself ready to fight the most powerful war machine in human history with an industrial base that produced farm equipment, railway cars, and not much else. In London, the British War Office studied maps and production charts with growing panic. America sat 3,000 miles away, wrapped in neutrality laws that would keep them out of the fight until December 1941. That meant 27 months of Britain standing alone, 27 months of needing weapons that nobody could make fast enough. The math was simple and terrifying. German factories were churning out 1,500 aircraft every month. British factories, even running day and night shifts, could barely make half that number. And German submarines were sending British cargo ships to the bottom of the ocean faster than new ones could be built. The British experts knew what they needed. They needed an industrial giant. They needed America's factories, America's steel mills, America's endless assembly lines. What they absolutely did not need was help from a frozen backwater that still thought of itself as a farming nation. When Canada's new Minister of Munitions and Supply proposed that Canadian factories could manufacture sophisticated military equipment, the response from London came back cold and clear. Colonial amateurs had no business attempting precision manufacturing. Canada should stick to what it knew best: wheat, lumber, and raw materials. The minister's name was Clarence Decatur Howe. His friends called him CD. Most British officials called him nothing at all because they had never heard of him. Howe was 53 years old, born in Massachusetts, trained as an engineer. He had spent 20 years building grain elevators across the Canadian prairies. Before the war, his job was managing radio broadcasting and railway shipping. Now, somehow, he was supposed to turn a nation of farmers and fishermen into an arsenal that could supply the British Empire. The conventional wisdom said it was impossible. Every expert agreed. Small nations did not compete with industrial powers. Countries without military factories could not suddenly start building complex weapons. The German war machine had spent 6 years preparing for this moment. They had the best engineers, the most advanced factories, the deepest experience in manufacturing tanks and planes and artillery. What chance did a country like Canada have? A country where the biggest factories made washing machines and steam locomotives? Howe sat in his Ottawa office and read the British rejection letters. He studied the production requirements. Britain needed 40,000 military vehicles immediately. They needed coastal patrol aircraft to hunt submarines. They needed convoy escort ships to protect the supply lines across the Atlantic. They needed all of this yesterday, and they needed it to keep coming every single day for however long this war lasted. The British estimates said Canada might be able to ship some raw steel, maybe some timber for building crates, nothing more. But Howe saw something the British experts missed. He walked through Canadian factories and saw potential hiding in plain sight. The John Inglis Company in Toronto made washing machines and home appliances. Their workers knew precision metalwork. Their machines could cut and shape steel to exact measurements. Why couldn't they make machine guns? Canadian Car and Foundry built railway equipment in Montreal. They had massive manufacturing floors, skilled workers, and experience welding large metal structures. Why couldn't they build aircraft? The country had textile mills, steel foundries, chemical plants, and tool and die shops. All of them sat mostly idle because peacetime demand had dried up. All of them employed workers who knew how to read blueprints and operate heavy machinery. Howe's first major insight landed like a thunderbolt. Building brand new military factories from the ground up would take 3 years, maybe 4. Converting existing factories might take 3 months. The machines were already there. The workers already knew their trade. All they needed were the right blueprints and the right materials. A washing machine factory was just a factory. Change what went into the machines, change what came out, and suddenly you had a weapons plant. The British War Office said no. The American suppliers said Canada could not afford it. The Canadian politicians said the public would never support such a massive industrial gamble. Everyone had a reason why it would fail. Everyone except C.D. Howe, standing in his Ottawa office, looking at a map of a country about to prove the whole world wrong. Howe called his plan the Shadow Factory System. The name sounded mysterious, almost magical. The reality was brutally practical. Take a civilian factory, any factory, keep the same building, the same machines, the same workers. Shadow it with military production. A company that made washing machines in peacetime would make machine guns in wartime. A railway car builder would build fighter aircraft. The factory's peacetime identity became just a shadow. Its real purpose was war. The first test case walked into Howe's office in October 1939. The John Inglis Company from Toronto made washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and home appliances. Their factory floor measured 200,000 square feet. Their workers were precision metal workers who could shape steel components to within 1,000th of an inch. Howe showed them blueprints for the Bren light machine gun. British infantry needed these weapons desperately. Could Inglis make them? The company president studied the drawings for 3 days. Then he said yes. They would need new cutting tools, new inspection gauges, and new assembly jigs. But the basic metal working skills were identical. His workers already knew how to do this. They just needed to build something different. The British War Office refused to send the technical specifications. A polite letter arrived from London explaining that precision weapons manufacturing required years of specialized experience. Colonial factories lacked the necessary expertise. The Bren gun demanded tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. One mistake and the weapon would jam in combat. British soldiers' lives depended on perfect manufacturing. Perhaps Canada should focus on simpler items like uniform buttons or mess kits. Howe picked up his telephone and called the one man in Britain who might listen. Lord Beaverbrook was born Max Aitken in New Brunswick, Canada. He had made his fortune in Canadian business before moving to London and becoming a British press baron. Now he served as a minister in Churchill's government. More importantly, he remembered what Canadians could do when everyone else counted them out. Howe explained his plan. Beaverbrook understood immediately. Within 2 weeks, a ship arrived in Halifax carrying complete technical drawings for the Bren gun, the Lee Enfield rifle, and the Hurricane fighter aircraft. The War Office never approved the shipment. Beaverbrook had simply bypassed them entirely. Money became the next impossible problem. Converting factories would cost millions. Buying machine tools, raw materials, and hiring thousands of new workers required cash that Canada did not have. The government's entire budget before the war was $500 million per year. Howe was proposing to spend double that amount just getting started. American suppliers wanted payment in advance. British orders came with vague promises of payment sometime after the war ended. No bank would touch a deal that risky, except one. The Bank of Montreal studied Howe's proposals and saw the same potential he did. In November 1939, they backed an unprecedented $1 billion war credit. $1 billion. The number seemed impossible. It was twice the value of all Canadian gold reserves. It was more than the entire Canadian economy produced in 6 months. But the bank's president understood something crucial. If Britain fell, Canadian money would be worthless anyway. They were betting everything on Howe's vision because they had no choice. The alternative was speaking German. The first Hurricane fighter rolled off the Canadian car and foundry assembly line in Montreal on February 9, 1940. 5 months. That was all the time it took to transform a railway car factory into an aircraft plant. The Hurricane measured 32 feet long with a 40-foot wingspan. It weighed 6,500 pounds empty. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine generated 1,030 horsepower. Building one required assembling over 30,000 individual parts to exact specifications. The wings alone contained 2,000 rivets that had to be placed perfectly, or the plane would tear apart in flight. British inspectors arrived to examine the first Canadian-built Hurricane with deep skepticism. They crawled over every inch of the aircraft. They measured tolerances. They tested control surfaces. They checked every rivet, every weld, every bolt. Then they sent a telegram to London that nobody expected. The Canadian Hurricane met every specification. In some areas, it exceeded British quality standards. The factory workers who once built passenger rail cars had built a fighter plane that could hunt German bombers over the English Channel. Howe set impossible targets, 40 aircraft per month within 12 months. The British said it could not be done. Aircraft manufacturing was too complex, too specialized. It took Boeing in America years to reach that kind of production rate. Canadian Car and Foundry was supposed to achieve it in 1 year? Impossible. But Howe had learned something about the word impossible. It usually just meant nobody had tried hard enough yet. By December 1940, the numbers told a story that stunned the world. Canada had shipped 1,451 military vehicles to Britain. 750,000 artillery shells sat in British ammunition dumps, all manufactured in Canadian plants that did not exist 14 months earlier. 52 Hurricane fighters had crossed the Atlantic, ready for combat. The British War Office had estimated Canada might produce 1/5 of those totals. The Colonials had delivered 300% more than the experts predicted. The John Inglis Company found its rhythm. Their first Bren gun took 8 hours to manufacture. Their 100th took 6 hours. Their 1,000th took 90 minutes. By late 1940, Bren guns rolled off their Toronto assembly line at a rate of 1 every 45 minutes. Workers who once assembled washing machine drums now assembled machine gun receivers. The precision was identical. The purpose was just different. A washing machine needed tolerance within 5/1000ths of an inch to work properly. A Bren gun needed the same. The workers already had those skills. They just applied them to saving the world instead of cleaning clothes. Small factories across Canada started receiving contracts. A textile mill in Quebec began making parachute silk. A chemical plant in Ontario started producing explosive compounds. A shipyard in Vancouver that built fishing boats received blueprints for corvette warships. None of these factories had any military experience. None of them had ever built weapons before. But they all had workers who knew their trade. They all had managers who could read blueprints and solve problems. That was enough. Howe was proving that expertise mattered less than determination. Experience mattered less than urgency. The arsenal was rising from farms and forests, and it was just getting started. The transformation happened so fast it seemed impossible. In 1939, Canada built exactly 9 military aircraft. 9. The entire year. By 1944, Canadian factories produced 16,431 aircraft. That meant going from less than 1 plane per month to over 45 planes every single day. The numbers felt like fiction. They were not. In 1939, Canada manufactured 0 tanks, 0 armored vehicles of any kind. By 1945, 815,729 military vehicles carried Allied soldiers across Europe. 50,000 of those were armored fighting vehicles. The rest were trucks, jeeps, ambulances, and transport carriers. A nation that could not build a single tank became the truck factory that kept 3 armies moving. The scale grew beyond anything Howe imagined in those early desperate months. By 1943, Canadian factories employed 1,200,000 workers. That was 10% of the entire Canadian population. 1 in every 10 people in the country worked in a war plant. They produced everything: corvette warships to hunt submarines. The shipyards built over 400 of them in multiple designs. Synthetic rubber for tires because Japan had captured the natural rubber plantations. Explosives, ammunition, aircraft engines, radio equipment. The total value reached $9.5 billion. In today's money, that would be $400 billion worth of weapons. From a country of 11 million people, but numbers alone cannot capture what this transformation really meant. Walk into the Canadair plant in Montreal on any day in 1943, and your senses would be overwhelmed immediately. The noise hit first. Rivet guns firing thousands of times per hour created a constant hammering roar that made your ears ring even with cotton stuffed in them. The smell came next. Aviation fuel, hot metal, welding smoke, machine oil, all mixing into a thick industrial fog that stuck in your throat. The building ran 24 hours a day. 3 shifts, 8 hours each. When the day shift workers walked out into the sunlight, the night shift was already firing up their tools under hanging electric lights that turned the massive factory floor bright as noon at midnight. Women made up more than half the workforce. They assembled PBY Catalina flying boats on production lines that never stopped moving. A Catalina measured 63 feet long with a wingspan of 104 feet. It weighed 20,000 pounds empty. Every plane contained miles of electrical wiring, thousands of rivets, hundreds of hydraulic connections. The workers built them in 72 hours, 3 days from bare metal frame to fully functioning aircraft. They did this over and over, plane after plane, month after month. Their hands moved with machine precision, because precision meant their brothers and husbands and sons might come home alive. The British War Office sent inspectors to Canadian factories expecting to find problems. They found the opposite. The Victory aircraft plant in Malton, Ontario, built Lancaster heavy bombers. Each Lancaster required installing 55,000 separate rivets. Miss one and the aircraft might break apart under combat stress. British inspectors tested Canadian-built Lancasters and discovered something shocking. The Canadian planes had better quality control than British-built versions. Fewer defects, tighter tolerances, more consistent assembly. Air Marshal Arthur Harris commanded the British bomber offensive. He sent a direct message to the War Office. He wanted Canadian-built Lancasters over British ones. The colonial amateurs were building better aircraft than the mother country. German intelligence noticed. Reports reached Berlin describing Canadian industrial output. The numbers seemed like Allied propaganda at first. How could a nation of 11 million outproduce Italy's entire war industry? Italy had 44 million people. But German agents confirmed the reports. They photographed the factories. They counted the ships leaving Halifax harbor loaded with weapons and vehicles. Canada was not just helping the British war effort. Canada had become a major industrial power almost overnight. Something had to be done. German submarine commanders received new targeting priorities. Hunt the Canadian convoys. The ships leaving Halifax carried the weapons keeping Britain in the war. Sink those ships and the arsenal dies. U-boats prowled the North Atlantic searching for the distinct profiles of Canadian merchant vessels. They found them. Between 1940 and 1943, German submarines sent dozens of Canadian ships to the bottom. Thousands of tons of Canadian-made weapons disappeared into the cold Atlantic depths. Workers in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver built replacement vehicles and aircraft and ammunition as fast as the submarines could sink them. The arsenal could not be stopped by drowning it. The production rate was too high. The workers too determined. Other Allied nations tried different approaches to war production. The Soviet Union built simple weapons in massive quantities. T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines by the tens of thousands, but each tank was crude and rough. American factories focused on overwhelming volume. Build enough Sherman tanks and enough would survive to win. The British tried maintaining peacetime quality standards while scaling up slowly. Canada found the middle path. Sophisticated weapons built with surprising speed. Hurricane fighters as good as anything Britain produced. Bren guns that never jammed. corvettes that hunted submarines effectively despite being built in shipyards that once made fishing boats. The unexpected consequences kept appearing. Canadian chemical plants learned to make synthetic rubber so well that American tire companies started buying Canadian product. The process was supposed to be inferior to natural rubber. Canadian chemists made it work anyway. Explosives plants in Quebec became so efficient at making TNT that British ordnance factories requested Canadian technical advice. The students were teaching the teachers. The colony was showing the empire how things were done. Numbers told the final story of scale. Canada produced more military trucks than Germany. Read that again. A nation of 11 million people, with no automotive industry before the war, built more military vehicles than the German industrial machine that conquered most of Europe. Canadian factories manufactured enough small arms ammunition to supply every Canadian soldier with 12,000 rounds each. Except Canada also shipped ammunition to Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Free French forces. The actual total reached into the billions of rounds. The corvette program revealed the true depth of Canadian transformation. These small warships measured 200 to 5 feet long, displaced 950 tons, and hunted German submarines in the most dangerous waters on Earth. Canada built hundreds of them in multiple variants, but Canadian engineers wanted better. They designed a larger version. The River-class frigate measured 301 feet long and could stay at sea for weeks hunting submarine wolf packs. Canada built 70 of these improved warships. A country that built fishing boats in 1939 was designing and manufacturing its own combat vessels by 1943. The naval architects were Canadian, the steel was Canadian, the workers were Canadian, and the ships worked. By late 1944, Canada ranked 4th among all Allied powers in total war production. 4th, behind only the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. Ahead of France, ahead of China, ahead of every other nation fighting the Axis powers. The arsenal that experts said could never exist was pumping out weapons that turned the tide of history. And it all started because one engineer refused to believe that small nations had to stay small. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945. The guns fell silent. The factories kept running. What do you do with an arsenal when the war is over? Canada faced this question with 1 million workers still building weapons nobody needed anymore. The massive plants that built Lancaster bombers could not simply close their doors and send everyone home. These workers had skills now. They knew precision manufacturing. They understood complex assembly. They had transformed themselves from farmers and fishermen into industrial craftsmen. That knowledge did not disappear just because Germany surrendered. The munitions plants became something new. Victory Aircraft in Malton stopped building Lancaster bombers in September 1945. By 1946, the same factory floor was designing jet aircraft. The company changed its name to Avro Canada. The workers who once riveted bomber fuselages now built the CF-100 Canuck, Canada's first jet fighter. Then they designed the Avro Arrow, a supersonic interceptor so advanced it made American engineers nervous. The plant that learned to build warplanes in 1940 became Canada's aerospace industry. The skills transferred perfectly. Building a jet fighter used the same precision metalwork as building a Hurricane, just faster and higher. Canadian Car and Foundry went back to railway equipment. Sort of. They built passenger train cars again, but they also built subway cars for Montreal and Toronto. They built specialized industrial equipment. They built anything that required welding large metal structures to exact specifications. The company eventually became part of Bombardier, a global transportation giant. The connection was direct. War production taught Canadian workers they could build anything if they had good blueprints and strong determination. The John Inglis Company returned to making home appliances. Their factory still stands in Toronto. During the war, they built 186,000 Bren guns. After the war, they built washing machines again. But the company was different. The workers were different. They had spent 6 years proving that precision manufacturing was just precision manufacturing. Whether you built a machine gun or a washing machine did not matter. The skills were identical. That confidence never left. Canadian manufacturing had learned it could compete with anyone in the world. The shipyards faced the biggest transformation. Canada built 434 corvettes and 70 frigates during the war. When peace came, those same shipyards started building merchant vessels, fishing boats, and eventually offshore oil platforms. The workers who welded warship hulls in 1943 were welding oil rigs in the North Atlantic by the 1970s. Same skills, different purpose. The war had taught them how to build massive steel structures in hostile environments. That knowledge powered Canada's offshore energy industry for the next 50 years. C.D. Howe became the most powerful politician in Canada after the war. People called him the Minister of Everything. He was not actually the Minister of Everything, but the nickname fit. He rebuilt the Canadian economy from 1945 to 1957. The Trans-Canada Pipeline that brought natural gas from Alberta to Ontario was his project. The St. Lawrence Seaway that let ocean ships reach the Great Lakes was his vision. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation that united the country through radio and television answered to him. Every major infrastructure project in post-war Canada seemed to have Howe's fingerprints on it. His approach never changed. Find the problem. Figure out the solution. Ignore the experts who say it cannot be done. Build it anyway. The same mindset that turned washing machine factories into weapons plants now turned Canada into an industrial nation. Howe died in December 1960, killed in a plane crash at age 74. Outside Canada, almost nobody remembered his name. Inside Canada, only historians knew the full story of what he accomplished. He saved the British Empire, and nobody threw him a parade. The military learned the most important lesson. NATO was formed in 1949 to counter Soviet power. The alliance needed a plan for wartime production. How do you prepare for industrial war without maintaining massive standing armies? The answer was obvious. Use the Canadian model. Keep civilian factories running in peacetime. Prepare detailed conversion plans. Train workers in precision manufacturing. When war comes, flip the switch and turn the economy into an arsenal. Every NATO nation adopted some version of this approach. The shadow factory system became standard military planning throughout the Cold War. Soviet intelligence studied Canadian war production for decades. They could not understand how it worked so well. Soviet factories were purpose-built for military production. They ran inefficiently in peace and efficiently in war. Canadian factories ran efficiently all the time and could switch purposes in months. The flexibility gave Western nations a huge advantage. You could not bomb a Canadian-style arsenal out of existence because there was no single target. Every textile mill might become a parachute factory. Every automotive plant might start building tanks. The entire economy was a weapon waiting to be activated. The broader lesson cut deeper than military planning. Small nations with limited resources can accomplish incredible things if they refuse to accept limitations. Canada in 1939 had every reason to believe it could not compete with major industrial powers. Too small, too poor, too inexperienced, too far from the fighting. Every expert agreed. The statistics supported this view. Common sense demanded it. But common sense is often wrong when people decide to ignore it. Modern supply chain crises reveal the same truth Canada discovered in 1940. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, nations suddenly needed masks, ventilators, and vaccines faster than traditional supply chains could deliver. The countries that adapted fastest were the ones willing to convert existing factories to new purposes. Automobile plants built ventilators. Clothing factories sewed masks. Whiskey distilleries made hand sanitizer. The playbook was 80 years old. It still worked because the underlying principle never changed. Adaptability beats capacity. Speed of conversion beats size of existing industry. China learned this lesson and became the world's factory by applying it ruthlessly. They could manufacture anything because their factories were designed to switch products quickly. India is learning it now, converting their massive textile industry into electronics manufacturing. Vietnam learned it by transforming from agriculture to advanced manufacturing in one generation. The Canadian model from 1940 keeps appearing everywhere because it works. Small nations become big powers by refusing to stay in their assigned roles. What does this story teach us? That credentials matter less than determination. That expertise is valuable, but adaptability is essential. That the people who say something cannot be done are usually just the people who have never tried. Canada was not supposed to become an arsenal. The British experts said so. The statistics proved it. The conventional wisdom demanded it. None of that mattered because C.D. Howe and 1 million Canadian workers decided the experts were wrong. The washing machine workers who built Bren guns were not weapons experts. The railway workers who built Hurricane fighters were not aircraft engineers. The fishing boat builders who constructed corvettes were not naval architects. They were just people who knew their trade and applied those skills to a bigger purpose. That might be the deepest lesson of all. Ordinary people doing ordinary work can change the world when the stakes are high enough and someone gives them the chance to try. Canada proved it. The arsenal rose from nowhere because nowhere was just a place that nobody had looked closely enough to see the potential hiding in plain sight.